This week's Torah portion is actually a double header, and we'll go through the overview as we did in a few weeks leading up to this week, the prior few weeks. We'll give an overview of the two Torah portions, following which we will get right in to tonight's class. There we go. Tonight's class about the joy of family. We'll get there momentarily. All right, the overview of this week's Torah portion. The first Torah portion is Achrei, sometimes referred to as Achrei, and the Torah portion discusses what happened following the deaths of Nadav and Avihu, who were Aaron, the high priest, two children. If you recall, 2 weeks ago, we discussed their sudden passing on the day of the inauguration of the temple, of the tabernacle in the desert. And following their deaths, God warns against unauthorized entry into the holy, which was a part of the tabernacle. Only one person, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, may but once a year on Yom Kippur enter the innermost chamber in the sanctuary to offer the sacred Ketoret to God. The Torah portion then continues. Another feature of the Day of Atonement service is the casting of lots over 2 goats to determine which should be offered to God and which should be dispatched to carry off the sins of Israel to the wilderness. The Parsha of Achrei also warns against bringing karbanot, sacrifices, animal or meal offerings, anywhere but in the holy temple, forbids the consumption of blood, and details the laws prohibiting incest and other forbidden sexual relations. We then move along to the second Torah portion that we read this Shabbos, this week's second Torah portion. The Parsha of Kedoshim begins with the statement, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, is holy." This is followed by dozens of mitzvot, divine commandments, through which the Jew sanctifies him or herself and relates to the holiness of God. Those include the prohibition against idolatry, the mitzvah of charity, the principle of equality before the law, Shabbat, sexual morality, honesty in business, honor and awe of one's parents, and the sacredness of life. Many, many details discussed in the Torah portion of Kedoshim, and obviously we don't have time to discuss all of them, and suffice it to say that we have discussed it in prior years. God willing, we will discuss them further, sorry about that, in coming years. And on Shabbos, we will discuss it as well. Also in Kedoshim is the dictum that the great sage Rabbi Akiva called a cardinal principle of Torah, and of which Hillel said, this is the entire Torah, the rest is commentary, the one we are all familiar with. Love your fellow as yourself. V'yahavta l'reacha kamocha is in this week's Torah portion. And now we get into the topic that we will be focused on. You know, they say the story that the rabbi walks into the lobby and notices little Kathy standing by the plaque and analyzing the words on the plaque. And the rabbi walks over to her and she says, "Rabbi, what are all these names of people on this plaque here in the lobby of the synagogue?" And the rabbi says, "Well, these are all people who lost their lives in the service." And so worried, she looks up at the rabbi and she says, "Which service? Was it Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur?" When it comes to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we have this idea, this imagery of sitting in the synagogue for hours on end, the rabbi using it as an opportunity to say all the jokes and all the insights and all the ideas he may have collected throughout the year, and he finally can say them with his biggest crowd. He's excited and he goes on hours on end. Seems to be that the prayer book has the same excitement. It's been a year since many people have been in the synagogue, and so Yom Kippur is a perfect opportunity to get everyone to turn as many pages as possible for as many hours as possible. Obviously, that's not the purpose, and as we discuss every year leading up to the high holidays, but in fact, in the times of the temple, the system was very, very different. In temple times, Yom Kippur was primarily focused not so much on the synagogue, rather on the high priest. Because on Yom Kippur, as detailed in this week's Torah portion, on Yom Kippur, the high priest was very busy performing all the mitzvahs and all the sacrifices and all the services that had to be performed in the temple were performed by the high priest himself. And that's what it focused on, where he, in the name of all the Jewish people, would be asking for atonement for all of the Jewish people. As this week's Torah portion discusses, beginning from text 1. If you have the book in front of you, it begins on page 37. Text 1 is a quote from this week's Torah portion. For on this day he shall effect atonement for you to cleanse you. Before God you shall be cleansed from all your sins. It is a Sabbath of rest for you, and you shall afflict yourself. It is an eternal statute. You shall afflict yourself as a reference to the idea that we don't eat, we don't drink, we don't wear leather shoes, we don't anoint ourselves, no creams and no showers, and so on and so forth. It's consecrated for holiness and for the Almighty. And the Kohen who is anointed, the high priest, the verse continues, and who is invested to serve in his father's stead, shall effect this atonement, and he shall don the linen garments, the holy garments. And he shall effect atonement upon the Holy of Holies, and he shall effect atonement upon the tent of meeting and upon the altar, and he shall effect atonement upon the Kohanim and upon all the people of the congregation. All this shall be as an eternal statute for you, to effect atonement upon the children of Israel for all their sins once each year. And he, the high priest, did as the Lord had commanded Moses. This was what the purpose of Yom Kippur is and was, especially in the time of the temple, where the high priest would be busy performing all of the sacrifices. And we'll just run through a few of the selected texts, short, not the full high holiday liturgy, which discusses a few of the awesome moments that the high priest would perform and the Jewish people would experience on this high holy day of Yom Kippur in the temple times. And we actually read this text on Yom Kippur every single year during the Musaf, the repetition of the Amidah, of the Musaf prayer on Yom Kippur, and it's called the Avodah. The Avodah, literally translated, means the service. It was the service that was performed by the high priest in the temple, and the purpose is to give us imagery of what went on in the temple, and God willing, speedily in our days, what will go on in the third temple, may it be rebuilt speedily. And so we'll begin text 2a, b, c, and d. 4 quotes from the high holiday liturgy, giving us the imagery of what went on in the temple on Yom Kippur. The first text we have is the high priest asking God to forgive the Jewish people for their sins. And this is what he said: O God, your people, the house of Israel, have sinned, have committed iniquity, and have transgressed before you. I beseech you, for the sake of your ineffable name, grant atonement for the sins, iniquities, and transgressions that your people, the house of Israel, have sinned, committed, and transgressed before you. As is written in the Torah of Moses, your servant, in your glorious name, for on this day atonement shall be made for you, to purify you of all your sins before the Lord. And the next paragraph, which is read in the shul, typically with a beautiful, stirring melody, we recall the display of awe in response to the high priest uttering God's ineffable name in its fullest, the tetragrammaton, which traditionally we do not say. The only one who would say it would be the high priest on Yom Kippur. And when he would say it right here, he would end off this prayer to purify you of all your sins before the Lord, uttering God's name. This was the reaction. And when the priests and the people standing in the temple court heard the glorious and awesome name fully pronounced, issuing from the mouth of the high priest in holiness and purity, they would bend their knees, bow down, and fall on their faces and exclaim, "Blessed be the name of the glory of his kingdom forever and ever." Another highlight of the high holiday services is towards the end when the high priest would say another special prayer for the well-being of the Jewish people and to grant them a good year. You may recall this prayer. We usually say it out loud in English. The following was the prayer of the high priest. May it be your will, Lord our God and God of our fathers, that this coming year shall be for us and for all your people, the house of Israel, wherever they are, rich in rain if it is hot. And when the world is in need of rain, do not permit the prayers of travelers with regard to rain to gain entrance before you. Parenthetically, because travelers are always praying that it shouldn't rain. May your people, the house of Israel, not be dependent for their livelihood upon one another, nor upon any other people. May it be a year that no woman will suffer miscarriage, and that the trees of the field yield their produce, and may there not depart a ruler from the house of Judah. Finally, when we finish reading about the service, during the high holiday liturgy, we conclude with a stirring rendition of a piyut, a paragraph that's called Mara Koyen. Mara Koyen, it's a long, beautiful explanation and imagery of what the high priest looked like. The holiness, the shine, the glow that emanated from him when he left the temple, concluding his service. And just to quote a few lines of that paragraph of that prayer, and so how radiant was the high priest as he came out of the Holy of Holies in peace. Like the resplendent canopy spread over the vaults of heaven was the appearance of the priest. Like the lightning that flashes from the brilliance of the angels was the appearance of the priest. Like the celestial blue twined in the four fringes of the tzitzis was the appearance of the priest. It's a reference to the priest referring to the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. Like the iridescent appearance of the rainbow in the midst of the cloud was the appearance of the priest. So that's the general idea of what went on in the Holy of Holies, of what went on in the temple, of what went on in Yom Kippur in the original way that it went on in the temple. Now, the purpose of the entire procedure and process and service was in order for the Kohen Gadol, as mentioned right in the beginning from this week's Torah portion, to effect forgiveness from the Almighty to the Jewish people. He had an awesome task laid out before him. And the high priest had to be spiritually, mentally, and physically in shape for that big day. There was a lot to do. There was a lot of focus that had to be on his part. And it was physically taxing. And so he had to be prepared. And the Mishnah gives us the details on how that preparation went. The Mishnah from the tractate Yuma. It's an entire tractate that talks about Yom Kippur, the actual 10th day of the month of Tishrei. And this is what the Mishnah tells us. 7 days before Yom Kippur, the high priest is removed from his house into the chamber of the anointed ones, which was a chamber in the temple. He was set aside and that's where he lived for that week preceding Yom Kippur. Another priest is designated to stand in his place in the event that something happens that disqualifies him from being able to perform the service. That's the first half of the Mishnah. It's kind of readily understood. He's about to undergo the most important day of the year, if not his life. Every year, that day was the most important day of his life. And so he had to be perfectly prepared. He needed to be set aside for a full week. The main purpose of why it was a week and not 6 days and not 8 days was in order to ensure that he does not become impure. He doesn't come in contact with something which is impure, which would render him impure, and then the high priest would be unfit to serve in the temple. And so to ensure that that doesn't happen, he would be set aside in the temple for a week preceding Yom Kippur, where he would prepare himself. And the Talmud goes at length to discuss how he would prepare himself mentally, physically, spiritually for this awesome task. But now we'll go on to the second half of the Mishnah. And the second half of the Mishnah is where really we get into the topic of tonight's class, and which gives us a certain understanding of an idea that Judaism puts a lot of emphasis on, and it's not just for the high priest. Here's the second half of the Mishnah, talking about the preparation of the high priest. Rabbi Yehuda said, another wife is designated for the high priest in case his current wife should die. As it says, and he shall make atonement for himself and for his household. The term his household refers to his wife. What's Rabbi Yehuda quoting? What's he talking about here? He's talking about as follows. Here's a quote from this week's Torah portion. And no man shall be, this is the verse in the book of Leviticus in this week's Torah portion, and no man shall be in the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, the temple, when he, the high priest, comes to effect atonement in the holy until he comes out. And he shall effect atonement for himself, for his household, and for all the congregation of Israel. Now, the verse literally means for himself. Literally, he's effecting atonement for himself as an individual, for his household, for his own family, and by extension, his Jewish family, the congregation of Israel. But the word in Hebrew that's used, it says, v'chiper ba'adai. Ba'adai means for himself. Uva'ad beisei. It doesn't say for his family. It says, and for his household. What does the word his household, his home, beisei, mean? And the Talmud discusses it. And the rabbis explain that the word beisei over here refers specifically to his wife. He effects atonement for himself, for his wife, and for all of Israel. Now, if the verse is telling us that he has to effect atonement for himself and for his wife, that obviously means that according to Torah, he must be married. Because if he's single, how can he effect atonement for his wife if he does not have a wife? And in the words of one of the early codifiers of Jewish law, Maimonides, text 5, he says so very clearly. The sacrificial service for all of these special Yom Kippur offerings on this day must be performed only by the high priest. Similarly, all of the other services performed on this day that are not unique to Yom Kippur, such as the offering of the daily incense offering, the kindling of the menorah's lamps, these were not unique to or exclusive to Yom Kippur. They were done every day. But even those regular services in the temple that were done daily on Yom Kippur, they were all performed by a married high priest. As the verse states, and he shall atone for himself and his household. His household refers to his wife. So the Torah is very, very clear. The high priest on Yom Kippur must be married. To the extent, as we quoted in the Mishnah earlier, Rabbi Yehuda says, we're worried maybe something's going to happen to his wife. And what happens if he's set aside for that week preceding Yom Kippur, and the day before Yom Kippur, his wife, God forbid, his wife passes away? Now he's single, he can't perform what he has to do in the temple. So we set aside, there's another woman, Rabbi Yehuda says, who's set aside for him to marry. Now the Talmud does not agree with Rabbi Yehuda. He's the minority opinion. And the law follows the majority opinion who says, in Hebrew we say, Ein l'davar seif. There's no ends to such a worry. Maybe if you set aside a second wife, you have to set aside a third woman, because who says the second one won't pass? If you set aside a third woman, maybe we should set aside a fourth woman. It goes on to no end. And so the majority opinion holds we don't set aside anyone else. And we just have to make sure that the high priest is married to service the temple. And as Maimonides puts it very clearly, the high priest must be married. Which of course brings us to very obvious questions. What are the obvious questions when we read these laws, this specific law? The first one is, why? Why is it so important to have a married high priest? What does marriage have to do with Yom Kippur? What? What's the reason for it? And the second question is, If the high priest has to be married, why can't the verse just say so clearly, and the high priest shall be married? Just say it clearly. What does the verse do? It hints to us that he should effect atonement for himself, for his household, and we need the rabbis to come and tell us that household means wife. If it's so important for him to be married, why couldn't the Torah state so clearly? And he shall be married. Why is it cryptically told to us, and his household? To understand this idea and these questions raised, it'll lead us into a very, very important discussion. And that is Judaism's idea of a family. And it's a question that I've gotten as a rabbi and as a father and as a member of a family that I have we're 8 siblings, thank God. It's a question that I get all the time. Why do religious Jews have such large families? Why does Judaism seemingly put this overemphasis on having families, children, and large families? And so that's what we're going to discuss today, the Jewish idea of families. Other religions look at marriage as a weakness, concession to human weakness. It's an outlet for certain bodily needs that are perceived as inherently mundane. And in other religions, celibacy is worshipped as an ideal. Whereas in Judaism, nothing could be farther from the truth. Judaism maintains that family is at the center of religion. Far from being a sin, procreation in Judaism is a great mitzvah, a sacred act. As a matter of fact, it's the first mitzvah that we are told in the Torah, be fruitful and multiply. And it's something that was always part of Judaism, and people of other religions always recognize that uniqueness within Judaism as opposed to other religions. Here's a quote from the 4th century writer, Achrei. He was a writer in Persia in the 4th century, and he had a long conversation with a Jew, and he describes it, what the Jew had told him. Text 6. He writes as follows: They, the Jews, say, when God created Adam, he thus blessed him, saying to him, be fruitful and multiply, procreate and fill the earth. Also to Noah in the same way he said, be fruitful on the earth and procreate in it. He blessed Abraham, saying to him, look to the heavens and count the stars if you can. He said to him, thus shall your seed be. And to the Jewish people in the blessings he said, there will not be among you a barren male and barren female. Again he said, there shall not be a sterile man and a barren woman in your land. In the blessing, Isaac was given to Abraham, and Isaac prayed for Rebekah that she might give birth. He blessed Jacob that his seed might multiply. Hannah beseechingly asked for Shmuel, Samuel the prophet's mother. Numerous was the procreation of the barren through the promise, and all the righteous receive seed and blessing. But you, the Christians, do a thing which was not commanded by God, for you have multiplied barrenness. You have prohibited procreation, the blessing of righteous men. You do not take wives, and you do not become wives for husbands. You hate procreation, a blessing given by God. So here we are almost 2,000 years ago. The value Judaism places on family was something that set it apart from other cultures and religions and values. It's clearly, as this scholar mentions his discussion with the Jews then, the tremendous emphasis that the Torah puts on having a family. As a matter of fact, as the scholar mentions here, and as we mentioned earlier, right from the get-go, in the book of Genesis, chapter 3, chapter 1, the first chapter of the Torah. We have God telling Adam and Eve. And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. And rule over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the sky and over all the beasts that tread upon the earth. Be fruitful and multiply. That's what man was tasked with from the first moment of creation. The first day when God created Adam, be fruitful and multiply, he was commanded. And in an even larger context, Judaism views the notion of having children and establishing a family as part of the very purpose of creation. In the words of Isaiah the prophet, for so said God, the creator of heaven, who is God, who formed the earth and made it. He established it. He did not create it for a waste. He formed it to be inhabited. I am God, and there is no other. God created the entire world. The purpose of creation was for procreation, for not laying the world to waste. Be fruitful and multiply. And the Rebbe would speak about this often, encouraging others. The Rebbe would speak about this idea and the unique value within Judaism, as opposed to other religions and cultures, as opposed to the prevailing atmosphere. The idea and the emphasis that Judaism places on having large families. Here's a talk from the Rebbe in 1980, summer of 1980, where the Rebbe discusses this exact idea. Bearing children is a mitzvah in the Torah, and not just any mitzvah. It's the very first mitzvah in the Torah. Sequence in Torah is significant. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and conquer it is quite literal, namely that we should have children, many children, and raise them in a manner that they can go out and conquer the world. Jewish ethical works speak of this idea. On the verse, and you shall light the candle, stated regarding the menorah in the book of Numbers, they speak of the notion that every Jew is considered a candle. A candle is not meant to lie in a box unused. Rather, the whole point is to place it in a candelabra and to kindle it, together with the rest of the Jewish people. From the moment he or she is born, every Jewish child is a candle. The goal is to raise them to be an illuminating candle, so much so that they eventually fill the earth and conquer it. So the emphasis, the importance, according to Judaism, of having children can't be overemphasized. Having families can't be overemphasized. It's a core value in Judaism from the Torah, from the get-go, from the book of Genesis. Now that we understand this idea, how important it is to have children, now we can understand why the term from marriage referred to in our Torah portion is household, house. Why is that? In the Jewish world, in Torah, in Judaism, marriage is not only about developing a relationship. While that's definitely a critical component of any marriage, and we'll discuss that a little bit further on, According to Judaism, marriage cannot be disconnected from the notion of creating a family. In the view of Judaism, having children isn't something separate from marriage. Rather, it's what's part of it. It's very much part of its essence, of the very idea of marriage. In other words, you can't think of a Jewish marriage without thinking about family as well. There's a famous saying that a woman turns a house into a home. In Judaism, this idea is intuitive, not just because it is intuitive, it's natural, that's the way it works, but more so because when a couple have children, it's not just two people living side by side. It's now become a family. Their DNA is baked into that next generation. They're a family, a living, breathing unit that can take on the world. Now they've become a true home. And so Judaism places tremendous idea, tremendous focus, tremendous value on this idea to always think of our marriages in that way. And so when the Torah talks about a marriage, it calls it a home, calls it a house. Because it's not just a relationship, it's also that. And that's very important. But it's not just that. Now, none of what we just mentioned is to say that there doesn't exist a concept of marriage which is apart from the notion of starting a house. Certainly is. There's a husband, there's a wife element, two people, me and my spouse, who do things together, hopefully having a good time together, also having frustrations together. That's part of life. And the Talmud is full of ideas of the husband and wife and examples of it, of the relationship, the beauty of nurturing it, and so on and so forth. And the Torah itself tells us that for the first year of marriage, husband and wife must spend time rejoicing together, so much so to the extent that the husband is exempt of military service and of any other type of public service. During the first year, they're exclusively each other's, and they don't go out to battle even when everyone else is drafted. Here's a quote from the book of Deuteronomy. When a man takes a new wife, he shall not go out in the army, nor shall he be subjected to anything associated with it. He shall remain free for his home for 1 year and delight his wife, whom he has taken. But nonetheless, in this verse, the verse does not refer to this unit as a home, as a house. It refers to it as a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, but they're not a home yet, because they haven't taken it to that next level. The end of, it's not necessarily, it's not the end, it's just the beginning, but the completion of that unit. Now, obviously, let's not take this out of context. It's not the idea and the stereotypical idea of baby-making machines, and that's what it's all about. The Torah and Maimonides actually puts tremendous emphasis on ensuring that we don't get this mistaken notion. Here's a quote from Maimonides, who helps put this in context. Our sages commanded that a man honor his wife more than his own person and love her as he loves his own person. If he has financial resources, he should offer her benefits in accordance with his resources. He should not cast a superfluous measure of fear over her. He should talk with her gently, being neither sad nor angry. And so, nothing that we mentioned earlier is to minimize the relationship one must have and cultivate with their own spouse. What we are saying is that together with and mindful of this important level of building that relationship, cultivating that relationship, having children must also be part of the conversation. Because to view marriage as something exclusively in the domain of human relations and self-fulfillment is incompatible with Judaism. Understanding this idea, we can now get back to the high priest. What's the idea of the high priest? The idea of the high priest is the complete person, the holiest person, the most complete example of the perfect person. On the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur, in the holiest location, in the Holy of Holies, the holiest location in the entire world. That's what's happening on Yom Kippur. That is the expression of that day, because we're trying to tap into that oneness, that essence of the Almighty, to effect forgiveness for all of the Jewish people. And so, when we're talking about the high priest, we need someone who is the truest form of a servant of God. We need someone whose entire life is lived in accordance with the divine plan. And if it is, and now that we understand that marrying and having a family is part of the divine plan, a single man would not be fit, would not be considered complete for this purpose. Because that's the ideal of Judaism. That is what's considered a complete person, one who has marriage for the sake of having a family. And that's exactly it. We mentioned earlier, one of the questions is, why does it refer to it as Beis Sayid? He says that he has to effect atonement for himself and for his household. It doesn't say for himself and his wife, and the sages explain for his household means that he has to be married. And why didn't it just say that he should have a wife for himself and for his wife? It says for his household, and it means his wife. Because now we understand that marriage in and of itself isn't the ideal, isn't when one is complete. One is complete, ideally, in Judaism, when one is married and has a family, or at least married for the ideal of having a family. If he's married and having a family is not on his radar, even though he's married and he has a wife, that's not enough. And so if the Torah would have told us just that he has to be married, that can be someone who's just married, doesn't have a family, doesn't plan on it. That's not in his cards. He doesn't plan on it. What God decides to do with that plan is a different story. Obviously, we recognize the idea there's infertility and it has to be treated with seriously, and Judaism discusses it at great length. Each individual situation should be dealt with a competent Orthodox rabbi and so on. And it's not the end all of everything. But at least the ideal has to be there. It doesn't say that he has to have children. It says that he has to have that ideal. As the Talmud tells us, anyone who does not have a house is not a person. Now, the Talmud in context on a very simple level is speaking about a home in the regular sense. It's telling us the importance of a person needing to have a place to call home. If a person doesn't have a place to call home, he's not a mensch. He doesn't feel settled. He's not a person. A person has to have a place that he calls home, a castle to rule, a place to be. If someone doesn't know where they're going to spend the night, they don't know where the next meal is, they're not a mensch. But on a deeper level, what's the Talmud telling us? On a deeper level, the Talmud is telling us that who is complete, who is considered a complete person? One who has a home, not someone who's simply married, one who has this shared vision of building a house for God, a Jewish family. And that is why when the verse tells us that he has to be married, it calls it a home, that he has to have a house. In the words of the Rebbe, now we can appreciate what's so great about the fact that the high priest on Yom Kippur must be married. And moreover, one who understands that marriage is about building a home. This quality, in fact, makes him personally a more complete person. As the rabbi said, anyone who doesn't have a house is not a person. By having a house, one attains the true quality of a person. That's why the high priest has to be married. And that's why it cryptically tells it to us by using this term, his household, to show us that marriage is not the be-all, end-all, but it has to be with the purpose and the ideal of building a proper Jewish family. Which really gives us some insight in this idea. Judaism places the greatest focus on the home, greater than the synagogue, believe it or not, on a Jewish home. Greater than our office, greater than our work. The greatest aspect of our lives ought to be our proper Jewish home. And the building of it, ensuring that it's stable, ensuring that it's solid in its Jewish foundations. Which is why, interestingly enough, if there is a city that only has enough funds to build one structure, either a synagogue or the ritual bathhouse, the women's mikvah, which is the foundation of every Jewish family, that community has to build the mikvah before a synagogue, because a mikvah, the foundation of the Jewish home, is more important than a synagogue. The Jewish home is the most important place in Judaism. If a community has a Torah scroll and they don't have a mikvah yet, they got to sell that Torah scroll and use that for those funds to build the mikvah. That's how important the Jewish home is. And that's why the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur had to be married, with the ideal of understanding the greatness of building a proper Jewish family. And so circling back, this should give us the idea, and the practical application of this idea in each of our lives is to realign our focus. Where does our focus lie? Does it lie in our work? Does it lie in our goals, our personal goals? Or does it lie in building the Jewishness of our home? For ourselves, for those of us who have children, for our grandchildren, or for people who come in contact with us. Why people come in contact with us? As we mentioned earlier, the reality is not everyone has children. Either because that's what happened, this is the way God decided, this is where we are in life. But nonetheless, the verse tells us, interestingly enough, that children, obviously meaning literal children, also has a second meaning. Because the mission of a Jewish family, the mission of a Jewish woman, a Jewish man, even children, is to have not only literal children, but to have spiritual children. What are spiritual children? Here's an interesting quote from Rabbi Yitzchak Arama, famously known by his work, the Akedat Yitzchak, a 15th century sage. Whoops. Where are we? Here we are. He says as follows. An interesting analyzation of Adam and Eve, Eve's two names, as she's referenced in the Torah. Text 16, if you have the book, it's on page 51. Originally, Adam had called Eve Isha. It's the Hebrew for woman, emphasizing her parity with man, who was called Ish and Isha, man and woman. After the episode with the tree of knowledge, he called her Chava, Eve, emphasizing the female element within her and the fact that she was the mother of all subsequent human beings. Between these two names, the two functions of a woman are defined. On the one hand, as the Eshet Chayil, the woman of valor, she possesses all the ingredients that can raise her to the status of prophetess. On the other hand, her function is to become a mother. A woman who fails to give birth, just like a man who is sterile, has not forfeited her major function in life, as is proven from the verse, "Let not the barren proclaim, I am but a dried out tree." The verse continues, "I will give them in my house," God says, "and in my walls a place and a name better than sons and daughters." We hold the view that man's major function is the performance of good deeds, something quite independent of procreation. As is taught, the main progeny of the righteous are good deeds. If Jacob had been angry at Rachel for demanding children, else her life would not be worth living, it was precisely for this reason. With these two names, Isha and Chava, we understand that a woman has two roles, two distinct roles. And the Rebbe actually highlighted this to a woman in a personal correspondence on this matter. In Jewish life, there are duties and functions which God has allotted to the woman and those allotted to the man. Where a person for some reason is unable to perform a certain mitzvah or some of his or her functions, there is a ruling in the Torah, Torah's emes, Torah of truth, so called because all its teachings are true. The merciful one excuses a person who is incapable of performing his or her duty. Indeed, God, who knows what is in the heart of everyone, and knowing that were the person able, he or she would have performed it, considers the thought in place of the deed. And so, in practical terms, this expresses the idea that according to Torah, what are the two ways each one of us, regardless of our position in life, regardless of our situation, how can we, according to Torah, have children? Even if we're beyond the age to have literal children, even if we were never able to have children, for whatever reason, or whatever the situation, how can we still have children? There are two ways to go about it. First one is to perform good deeds. And the verse actually calls good deeds children. In the beginning of the book of Genesis, when it talks about Noah and his family, the verse tells us something interesting. It starts talking about Noah and his who he was, and it tells us these are the children of Noah. And then it goes on to list his accomplishments, his greatness, and only after discussing his accomplishments, his greatness, his good deeds, his saintliness, it then, in the following verse, tells us his literal children. And Rashi quotes the Midrash telling us, this teaches you that the main progeny of the righteous are their good deeds. Every mitzvah that we have has a lasting, and that we do, every good deed that we do has a lasting impact on the world. Our mitzvahs are our children. And every single Jew is who's being referred to over here as righteous. Another way how we each can have children is the people we meet, the people we encounter. Any person we encounter and we inspire to do another good deed, they are our children in that sense, because we have made them into a new creation by doing an extra good deed. And the verse actually tells us that. When it comes to Moses and Aaron, the verse tells us something interesting. Here's a quote from the book of Numbers. The verse tells us, these are the descendants of Moses and Aaron on the day that God spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai. These are the names of the sons of Aaron, Nadav the firstborn, Avihu, Elazar, and Itamar. Hold on. These are the descendants of Moses and Aaron, and it goes ahead to name only the children of Aaron. What's going on here? And it doesn't discuss the children of Moses at all in that entire chapter. So it's telling us that it's going to tell us the descendants of Moses and Aaron. It only tells us the descendants of Aaron, not the descendants of Moses. Seemingly something's amiss. Again, Rashi, our favorite commentary to the rescue, quoting from the Talmud. Yet only the sons of Aaron are mentioned. However, they are considered descendants of Moses because he taught them Torah. This teaches us that whoever teaches Torah to the son of his fellow man, Scripture regards it as if he had begotten him. And so Torah tasks us with this imperative, with this important aspect, foundational aspect, that each one of us is tasked with building the next generation of Judaism. We encounter someone, let's teach them something about Torah. Let's inspire them to do another mitzvah. We encounter ourselves. Let's do another mitzvah. Let's do another good deed. That good deed has an impact on us. It has an impact on the world over. That impact that we do inspires others. That mitzvah that we do inspires others to do a mitzvah. And then we have that next generation, twofold, our good deeds, and those that we come in contact with will also do another good deed. And so let us hope that in the merit of all these good deeds, in the merit of us having as many figurative children as possible, making an impact on this world one mitzvah at a time, inspiring one person at a time, will merit to see the high priest perform his service in the temple, and the third temple may be speedily rebuilt.